So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Tilly. I am on the leadership team for OH1, which is our 18s to 30s expression of Open Heaven in Loughborough. If I've met any of you before, hello. If I've not, welcome. It's lovely to meet with you on the chat. And hopefully next year we'll be able to meet in person. So the seminar that we are in right now is Leading When You're Not Okay by Patrick Regan. Now, Patrick Regan is a dear friend of Pioneer Network, has been for many years, and he is also the CEO of Kimsugi Hope, which is a charity which works on people's mental and emotional well-being. The talk that he's going to be bringing today is going to be pre-recorded, so he's already done that for us, and then we're going to end the seminar with a live Q&A. So he's going to come up on your screens, and we're going to ask him all our questions. So just encourage you as the talk is going on, do just be putting those questions, any questions you've got, in the chat for him. I'll be writing those down and I'll ask him when he comes on our screen. So he's going to be here live to answer those. So let's have lots of good questions ready for him. Yes, so I've had the privilege of already watching this talk before, and the fact that I am so excited to watch it again just shows how full of wisdom and practical insight it is. I'm really looking forward to watching it again, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy watching it for the first time. So buckle up, get ready for lots of wisdom, lots of insight, and get thinking of those questions as we go. So before I share the video, I'm just going to quickly pray. Yes, Holy Spirit, we thank you that you are so present in each and every one of us and in our rooms, that even when we're apart, we're still together. And God, we just pray that you would be preparing our hearts for this seminar, that what Patrick brings today is going to really resonate in our hearts and our minds. Jesus, would you help us to be vulnerable and real with ourselves as we watch this seminar? Would you meet us where each of us is, however we're feeling, however we're doing, whatever we've got on this week? Would this just be a time where we are really present and really listening? May it almost be like an act of self-care, and just being so present listening to this talk. So God, would you be moving? May you be talking, and may we get so much out of this. In your name, Jesus. Amen.
Hey everyone, it's so brilliant to be with you. My name is Patrick Regan. I'm the CEO of a charity called Kimsugi Hope, which is a charity that's wanting to create safe and supportive spaces for those that are struggling with emotional and mental health. So what we do really simply is train churches up to provide a wellbeing program in communities and in their churches. Training is online, and it's just been amazing to see what God's done. There are hundreds literally of these things happening all over the country. And I know that you guys in Pioneer have always been so encouraging to me personally when I was in XLP, and also now me and Diane running Kimsugi Hope. Got lots of love and respect for Ness and the team, and my mate Paul Weston as well. You guys have been a real blessing to us and to the church in this country. I'm going to be leading a session hopefully for about half an hour, 35 minutes, leading when you're not okay, and then afterwards we're going to have a bit of hopefully a time of Q&A, a bit of discussion, unpacking these topics. I've just recently taken a lot of this stuff that I'm doing today from a new book of mine called Bouncing Forwards, Notes on Resilience, Courage and Change. I believe that resilience isn't bouncing back, actually, and I don't think the economy will bounce back in the same way. I don't think we'll bounce back in the same way, and I don't want to. I don't want to go back to my pre-trauma self, all the stuff we went through in COVID, and I think it's about bouncing forwards. I think it's about saying that we've been changed for good and for bad. And so if you want to do this, then please, it's on our website, you can get hold of it. It's also been chosen for the Big Church Read. So there are resources there, videos there. You can read it as a church, you can read it in small groups, however you want to do it. So please check that out. That would be really fantastic. I guess I thought I'd tell you a bit of my story. I've done quite a lot of Zoom talks, and sometimes it's hard to hang in there. So stories for me always help me hang in there longer. And I was one of those leaders, and I don't know if any of you guys can relate to this, where I was just spinning too many plates, trying to be all things to all people. And because I'm quite need motivated, I used to take on complete responsibility for things. That if I was passionate about something, I'd be 100% in. And a lot of the issues that I was dealing with were just too big, dealing with mums whose kids have been killed due to knife crime. I've had to be at many memorial services, dealing with issues of abuse and domestic violence. I remember this 15-year-old girl who completed a suicide in one of the schools that I was working in. Just huge issues. I remember suddenly in 2011, I don't know if you remember the riots across London, and it was almost like I was thrown into the spotlight, and I was in this weird position where suddenly, the PM and other politicians were going, well, what's your advice on this, and how should we do this? And suddenly there was just this incredible opportunity, but just completely draining at the same time. And then around the same time, I got diagnosed with a degenerative knee condition, which means I need to get both my legs broken in 3 places and have an external frame with pins going through my leg and outside the other leg, and things being drilled into my bone. In fact, I remember wearing one of my frames at a Pioneer Leaders Conference and showing you all, and there was this massive intake of breath down in Southampton. And so there are 2 operations I had to go through, and you can see some photos of my leg coming up here, and how my kids react. Daniel turned it into a space station. That's Star Wars Lego right there. Abby turned it into a Christmas tree. And just before I had my second operation, Abby broke her leg, my daughter. So this photo is us having a Zimmer frame race down the end of our garden. And my son Caleb always likes to tell people that he won, because he was the only one without a broken leg, but there you go. And it was all this stuff, and I just describe it as the Tetris moment. Do you remember the game Tetris? All these blocks, they come out of nowhere. It was a computer game, and you try and get them in a straight line, you rotate them, but they just come too fast, and in the end you're like, I just can't do it anymore. And I think one of the challenges that we have as leaders is we know this. We know that we have a tendency to work too hard and just to keep going. So what we do is we rest for a bit, and then we just do the same thing. It's a little bit like if you get your phone works as well on 10% as it does 100%, right? It could do exactly the same on 100% as 10%. The challenge is it just doesn't last very long. And I think we get into cycles of living like that. It's like, okay, I feel a bit better, I'm going to go again. And it just gets in a situation, eventually, like the game Tetris, it can feel like game over. I remember this happened to me, actually, around the same time as the charity I was running has some visits from the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. I hope you caught those names as they dropped there. And there's some amazing photographs here of me coming up with the Duchess. It was interesting. The Duchess sat next to my wife Diane, and in one of these photos, she just turned to her and go, "Do you like my dress?" I'm not sure what you meant to say when the Duchess of Cambridge says, "Do you like my dress?" And so Diane was like, "Yeah, it's a really lovely dress, your Duchess." And she was going, "Oh, I'm really glad you like it, because William says I look like a tablecloth." If you look a little bit closer, I think he has a point. And but these photos, they literally went around the world. We were in OK Magazine, and magazines in Sweden I never heard of. It was on the BBC News. It was everywhere. And of course, when that happens, is people start contacting you, going, "Wow, Patrick, it's looking pretty good. Life." And the Facebook page looked fantastic. But the reality is, in these photos you've just seen, I'm someone who's really struggling with anxiety. And it was nothing to do with the Royals visiting. It'd been going on for years. And my life, the Tetris moment, had started to happen. And yet I told no one, because I was a Christian leader, right? And I felt this sense of shame. And when I had told people, it hadn't gone particularly well for me. People told me that I need to have more faith, or I needed to pray more, or I had let the devil have a foothold in my life. And I felt this real sense of shame. I lived by the shoulds, the must, I oughts. I should be able to cope. What's wrong with me? I've got a good family, good gig, good team. I must pull myself together. You're going to let everyone down. In fact, people told me that, pull yourself together. You're letting everyone down. I ought to be stronger. Get a grip. And I started to write. That's what I do when I in these moments. It saves on the therapy bills. It's great. And I wrote a book called Honesty Over Silence. And it was basically, I am fed up with the show. I am fed up with pretending everything's all right. I am desperately searching for something that's much more real and authentic and honest, because honesty breeds more honesty. And I thought, when I was writing the book, I was like, I think maybe I need to tone this down a little bit. I'll never get asked to speak anywhere ever again. And I read the Psalms. 40% of the Psalms are laments. That David crying out to God. I don't get it. In my research, I came across this one book called The Curse of the Strong, Clinical Depression, The Curse of the Strong, by Tim Katperner. He was a psychiatrist, and he basically said this, which was fascinating for me. He said that he could describe the personal characteristics of someone that's suffering from depression. And he said they were these: moral strength, reliability, diligence, strong conscience, a strong sense of responsibility, a tendency to focus on the needs of others before one's own, sensitivity, vulnerable to criticism, self-esteem dependent on the evaluation of others. I didn't sound like a weak person, but that's what I perceived that I was, a weak person. He said people that struggle with this were Oliver Cromwell, Abraham Lincoln, Vincent van Gogh, Winston Churchill, and Mother Teresa. Not weak people, but people who've been strong for too long. I came across the image of Kimsugi, and as you know, Kimsugi is a Japanese word called golden joinery, and it's when we get a pot and we break it, we tend to mend it with super glue, right? And the whole idea of super glue is you hide the cracks, you pretend it's not broken. What they do in Japan is they put a gold powder in the glue, so instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature of the cracks. Suddenly, the object becomes more beautiful for being broken. That beauty comes out of brokenness, that our scars are not there to be ashamed of. Our scars make us who we are. Jesus in his heavenly body had scars. There'll be scars in heaven. And so I suddenly realized that actually, is there a way that even though I don't feel completely like whole, that in my brokenness, that God can pour in the gold, pour in his love, and do something beautiful out of our lives. This is a little video of me and my friend Hannah doing the Kimsugi thing. Check this out.
My youngest son, Nathaniel, was at a friend's house. There was a confrontation with a boy that turned up and decided that he'd take a knife and stab Nathaniel with it. I feel like at that time I was in a bubble and feeling alone and not even knowing how to articulate that to anyone.
I had to have major limb reconstruction surgery. Around the same time, my daughter got a condition called HSP and my dad got cancer. It was like a perfect storm of things going wrong. And I realised that the anxiety was really taking root in my life. And then you realise that actually you can't just carry on and you need to show some self-compassion.
Bereavement is different for everyone. What's really important is that people are able to talk to someone that they can connect with. And through that, there's a real good healing process.
And actually maybe receiving help is letting go of your pride and saying, I am really broken. And as we share in our brokenness, we share in our common humanity.
The brokenness is my heart, and it's in pieces. But through time, it's starting to come together again.
There is so much I could say about this topic, but I just want to share really briefly 4 things, I guess, that really, really helped me. If I've got time, I might share a couple more, but one was this. I started to realise that when I'm leading, that courage and vulnerability are the same thing. Brené Brown describes this better than anyone else. She says, the Latin word for courage is cur. It means to speak your mind with your heart, to show up and let your true self be seen. That everything that involves courage involves vulnerability. And I look at the ministry of Paul. Paul was interesting, wasn't he? In 2 Corinthians 1 verse 8, he says this: we do not want you to be ill-informed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experience in the province of Asia. We are under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, that we have despaired of life itself. People don't always connect with your success stories, they connect to your scars. My chair of trustees is Simon Barrington. He wrote a book about what millennials are looking for in a leader. And what it came out of is, number 1 was passion, number 2 was humility, and number 3 was integrity. I want to lead well because of vulnerability, not despite of it. I don't want to be afraid of being a weak leader that reveals a really strong God. And I think that's what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians when he talks about us being treasure in jars of clay. The other second key thing I wanted just to throw in is I started to realise that acceptance and resignation are two very different things. Because people are like, how can you be that vulnerable? And is that allowed? And are we allowed to do that as leaders? Can we lead when you're with that level of vulnerability? And there's got to be boundaries, of course there has. And there's got to be some sensible thinking about context and stuff like that. But actually, people are like, just don't accept your lot. And I was like, well, I think acceptance and resignation are different things. So, for instance, when we were writing Bouncing Forwards, we looked at some of the characteristics of someone that survived a concentration camp. And I had the absolute privilege of interviewing Anne Frank's stepsister, Eva Shalos. And she was 91, she spent a year in Auschwitz. And it was really interesting, the research that came out of that period, because it said basically the people that didn't survive Auschwitz were the optimists. They were the people who said, don't worry, we'll be out by Christmas, we'll be out by Easter. It was funny, me and my wife, Diane, we were reminding ourselves of this when we were talking about the dates that all the government have set. You know, it'll be right, it will be fine by June. And actually, the people that survived the concentration camps weren't the optimists. It was those that accepted the situation they were in and adapted to it, that found almost purpose and meaning in some of the areas of their suffering. And it's incredible, isn't it? The amount of people that have just found in the midst of suffering, in the midst of pain, that actually their values have been challenged. Archbishop Desmond Tutu says this: we are meant to live in joy. This does not mean that life will be easy or painless. It means that we turn our faces to the wind and accept that this is a storm that we must pass through. We cannot succeed by denying what exists. The acceptance of reality is the only place from which change can begin. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is probably one of the most famous verses in the Bible and one of the most misquoted verses in the Bible. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, plans to give you a future and a hope. And, you know, it was written to a people in exile. The book of Lamentations describes the sadness that they felt orphaned and uncomfortable and that was suffering from huge despair. And it was written in the context of Hananiah, who went previously in Jeremiah 28 going, it's all right, guys. This exile will be over in 2 years. And actually Jeremiah has to go, you know what, that's an interesting prophecy and it would be nice if it was true. But the reality is it's going to be 70 years. 70 really difficult years. Some people won't make it out of exile. But you know what? This is not to be wasted. In other words, let's accept that this is a situation. But within that context, I want to give you plans to prosper you, to give you a future and a hope, which for me makes that verse even more incredible. And it talks about, you know, building gardens and settling down. In other words, just don't think about yourself. Think about the community around you. Pray for the peace and the prosperity of the city. You know, so often I've met people that don't accept. They go, you know, I'll be fine. Just once this project's over, after this funding bid's done, after this book's been written, after this series of talks been done. And actually what they do is they develop really damaging habits, pushing themselves too hard. There's no shame in asking for help. Struggling doesn't mean you failed, it means you're a human being. The third thing that I wanted to talk about is this area that I'm so passionate about at the moment, having just written a book on it, is how do we develop resilience? How do we lead when we're not okay? What are those things we need to put in our life? Alan Scott says this: the future doesn't belong to the brilliant, but the resilient. Not to those who avoid scars or pain, but to the wounded healers who choose to give again. You know, how do you develop resilience? Like I mentioned, is I believe that resilience isn't bouncing back, it's about bouncing forwards. It's about thriving in the midst of adversity. It was really interesting doing the research for the book. Harvard Business Review said this: more than education, more than experience, more than training, a person's level of resilience will determine who succeeds and who fails. That's true in the cancer ward, it's true in the Olympics, and it's true in the boardroom. Resilience isn't simply being tougher, trying harder. I really like this quote by Liggy Webb. It says this: the best thing anyone described resilience to me was as emotional sunscreen. It's not covering yourself with a protective shield, but creating a protective layer. It's thriving in the midst of adversity. One of the most helpful analogies that I come across is by Professor Patrick Regan. He says this: being well and healthy is a bit like rowing a boat. Illness or other kinds of problems can be thought of crashing into the rock. Most approaches to tackling difficulties tend to focus on the rock. But the problem with the rock is only half the story. The water level represents our background level of resilience. When we're feeling good in ourselves, with our emotional reserves that are high, we may float over the rocks. On a bad day, we'd hit. When we're feeling depleted, our water levels are low. We're more likely to crash. Now, I've got this little diagram here that's coming up on the screen, and actually you can download this if you want to do this exercise that I'm going to suggest in a minute. If you go to www.kintsugihope.com/bouncing forwards, you can download this diagram. And as you see in this diagram, there's some rocks at the bottom, and in the middle is our level of resilience. And what we wanted to look at is, what are those things that pushes our resilience levels up, and what are those things that drain us? And you can see the rocks in the bottom. Now, the rocks in the bottom can just be stuff that happens in life. So, for instance, for me, one of my rocks is anxiety. I haven't been healed of anxiety, but I've learned to manage my anxiety. But I know when I'm getting a lack of sleep, when I don't feel like I belong, when I'm letting perfectionism really affect my behaviour, my levels go down, and actually anxiety suddenly becomes very real again. You know, disappointments happen, doesn't it? Our health, again, I can't run because of the knees and the operations. I can cope with that, but when I'm depleted, suddenly that becomes that's a complete crash point for me. Family, teenage kids, sometimes they are amazing, other times they can say things that if I'm depleted, suddenly I react. It's World War III. And so these things can really affect us. So it's a really healthy thing to go, actually, what are the things that increases my anxiety, and what are the things that decrease it? And so I'd really recommend this, actually, doing it with your kids, doing it with your life group, doing it with your work teams, doing it as your church teams. It's really, really, really important. And I want to show you this little video clip now. This is made by my really good friends, Matt and Jess Cooper. It's an amazing little video that describes these levels of resilience. You can also get this off the website page. Check this out.
Resilience is like a river. Its levels can go up and down. On good days, when the water is flowing, we feel loved, encouraged and supported. We may float over the rocks and the challenges. But there are bad days too, where our levels are lowered. Trauma, loneliness, trying to fit in. The water has stopped flowing, and we are more likely to crash. What are the things that lower your resilience levels? And what brings them higher? Get your copy of Bouncing Forwards now.
So as leaders, what are those things that actually, when we're leading, when we're not okay, that we really need to work on? And I would say that as a leader myself, the number one thing I've had to work on over the years has been this whole area of self-compassion. When someone first said this to me, when I completely burnt out, I was like, that sounds awful. I hate that. That sounds selfish, navel-gazing. It sounds like I'm a bloke. I ain't doing no baths and candles. I'm not into that at all. It's selfish. We've got to be selfless. We've got to be Christ-like. And I remember a lovely Christian therapist saying to me, you've totally misunderstood what this is. Self-compassion isn't endless pleasure. Self-compassion and self-indulgence are two different things. You think self-compassion is lots and lots of nice food, a glass of wine each night to take the edge off. Actually, the things that you think self-compassion cause you harm in the long run. They're damaging habits that you can get into. Self-compassion is talking to yourself the way that you would talk to your best friend. It's silencing the inner critic. I don't know what your inner critic says to you, and particularly after you've preached or you led something. My inner critic's always really loud, and it'll probably be loud after this. You've fallen short. You should try harder. You've got no discipline. You should have studied a lot harder. actually, I'm not sure you communicated that in the best way. Have you noticed with our inner critic, nothing is off limits? There's no place it won't go. And it completely always compares yourself to other speakers. God, those guys in Pioneer, they could have got a lot better speakers than you, surely. They turn a weakness into an identity. I remember in our Kimsugi group, we did a Kimsugi group in our house before lockdown, and it was amazing. I mean, we did it as a life group, and we trebled in size because we invited all our neighbours and friends. But there was this week on self-acceptance that really got me, actually. We showed this video of this woman. She was talking about the lies we say to ourselves. And so she got her friends in, and she was saying, what sort of lies do you say to yourself? And, what's your inner critic saying? One was like, I'm just not good enough, I don't clean the house enough. Another one was like, you're exaggerating, selfish liar, which is a bit harsh. Another one was like, actually, you're not good enough mother for your kids. And then she showed a picture of their younger selves and said, would you say this to your younger self? And they looked at this picture of their younger self. They sort of laughed and going, no, of course I wouldn't say it to a younger self. They was like, what do you think that younger person needs to hear? Because that's what you're doing. You're actually saying that to the same person. And they were like, well, maybe that younger person needs to hear the fact that you're enough, that you matter, that you don't have to be all things to all people. And I was like, that's all right, I suppose. It's a bit American and girly. I'm not sure it's really into me. And a lot of people in the Kimsugi group were loving it, and there's a big conversation afterwards. The leader of our Kimsugi group said, why don't you write down what your inner critic says to you? So I did. I wrote down, just been a bit vulnerable with you. Number one, you're not intelligent enough. I'm not particularly academic, and it always bothers me a little bit because I hang around a lot of academic people. No one actually likes you. They just, because you're well known in certain circles, they have to like you. You're not enough. You got your OBE from the Queen because everyone around you is super talented. And there's maybe an element of truth in some of those things. But actually, it's harsh. It's harsh. It's aggressive. It lacks kindness. The really interesting thing was the day after we'd had our Kimsugi group and we'd done the self-acceptance exercise, I was in my parents' house and I was walking up the stairs and I saw this photo looking back. I had a really big head. And this photo and this photo. And God really got me. He was like, would you talk to that person the way you talk to yourself? And what do you think that person needs to hear? And I realised that actually the inner critic is exhausting. And so as leaders, I feel like we do it all the time. And we don't talk about it much. So let me be an alternative voice for you today, if you let me. How about saying you're doing the best you can? No one's led through a pandemic before, you know that. And we're all making this up as we go along. Making a mistake doesn't make you a failure. Struggling doesn't make you a failure. It makes you a human being. No one is perfect. It's okay not to be okay all the time. It's okay that everyone will not like you. Everyone is allowed a bad day. You are loved. And to do that thing is, what does God say over me? He says you're loved with an everlasting love. He says he rejoices over you with singing and dancing. You're fearfully and wonderfully made. You are a child of God. So maybe next time the inner critic says that, you remind him of those truths. The interesting thing when writing is there was this bit around accepting limitations. And I always sort of thought I grew up going, you can change the world, you can do this. I was part of the history maker generation. We bounced around a lot. And we were going to take God here, there and everywhere. And then I realised that God was already there. And I just got exhausted trying to take God everywhere and trying to be the rescuer when only Jesus can be the rescuer. And I think that's a really important thing for us as leaders. It's only Jesus. And actually accepting limitations is a sign of maturity. John Mark Comer in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, says limitations are good for us. But both inside the church and outside the church, we don't hear that. He says, imagine a book called Accept Your Limitations, How to Make Peace with Your Mortality and Cosmic Insignificance. It doesn't really have a New York's bestseller behind it, doesn't it? But we are limited. There are 24 hours in a day. The amount of leaders I've heard that go, I just need another day in the week. Well, no, there's a reason why there's 24 hours in a day. We're not going to live forever. Our body's limited. Our health is limited. I have bad knees. I can't do everything. Our personal circumstances. Some of us are getting to the stage of life where you want to care for your kids and care for your parents. It's a weird stage of life to be, isn't it? And we have to accept that and allow God to minister to us. In conclusion, I wrote a chapter in the book on kindness, and I guess the most famous story on kindness is the Good Samaritan, right? It's the story we all acted out as kids. And I don't know who you were in the story. In the one in our church, you know, we had someone who was a priest who was too busy praying to help the poor guy got beaten up on the side of the road. There was a social worker. And I always like to be the person, the rescuer, you know. And I always thought that that's what the story was, you know, help the poor Samaritan. And then there was this long, complex little bit how Samaritans and Jews hated each other and how it's really, really important. Samuel Wells, who I'm sure some of you are aware of some of his teaching, says this. I think this is challenging. We are not the Samaritan. We are the man by the side of the road. We are the one who is stripped. We are the one who is bruised. We are the one who's half dead. This is how we begin to reflect on the questions of compassion and good deeds in social justice. We are the needy ones. We long for relationship. We long for forgiveness. We long for reconciliation. We long for eternal life. And we'd be happy to accept these things from a priest or the Levite. These are people who seem like ourselves, people from our own social background. They have security. They have social esteem. They have resources. But the story is telling us these people can't help us. They can't give us what we desperately need. You know, I always used to think of pride as people that have just got big heads and annoying. They just like to talk about themselves all the time. I've started to realise that pride is probably the most hurt people I know because they refuse to allow people close to them. They keep people at a distance. And maybe it's not finding everyone, but finding those real people that you can be really real and honest with, to accept our brokenness. The Good Samaritan is Jesus. Jesus is the Good Samaritan. Jesus is the one who comes to us in our brokenness, that comes to us in our woundedness, and comes and brings a sense of healing and restoration. And that's why, for me, the Kimsugi image is so, so beautiful. Henry Nouwen, and I'll finish with this quote, I think is a quote I'm sure you've heard before. He says this: "Nobody escapes being wounded. We're all wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed, but how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be the source of shame and become a source of healing, we've become wounded healers." That's my prayer, is that we would become wounded healers. And as we come out of lockdown and COVID, that there's going to be a time where people will just process things so differently. The entrepreneurs will want to get going straight away. Others are going to need to grieve a lot longer. Some people are going to rush out and then realise actually all their relationships change and get a little bit disillusioned. And leading through that is going to be a challenge for all of us. And so what we do need to go gently, and we need to be kind, and we need to stay connected to one another. So let me pray for you, Pioneer people, you lovely Pioneer people, and other people that have joined in today. And if there's anything in Kimsugi Hope that we can do to support, to train, to help create safe spaces, particularly in this season, do get in touch with us. We'd love to help and serve where we can. Father God, thank you for the network of Pioneer. Thank you for the stuff that you're doing in this movement, Lord, for Ness and the team. And we just pray, Lord, we've literally just scratched the surface on this stuff. But I pray, God, that you would help us to accept the situation we live in and adapt to it, Lord, to realise acceptance and resignation are really different things. To realise that courage and vulnerability are the same thing. And God, and to look at this area of resilience, to increase our levels, Lord God. I pray that people would start to be really self-aware. In this next season, what do we do? How do we go over those rocks instead into them? In Jesus' name, Amen.
Amen. Right, I'm going to try and stop sharing. Thanks, Patrick. That was amazing. Amazing. Such raw honesty. But such wisdom all at the same time. Okay, I think my computer is slightly lagging, so please do bear with if I'm a bit slow, but I'm going to go with it. In Jesus' name, it's going to stop. So yeah, guys, as I said at the beginning, this is the time of Q&A now, so if you do have any questions, do get them going in the chat. But yeah, as you can see, Patrick, there's so much thanks coming through, and yeah, encouragement for that talk. So one question to kick us off with, that we had earlier was, how do we as leaders balance the balance being open and honest whilst also not wanting to overshare, and being unhelpful for the people we're leading?
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant question, and it's really hard one to work out. I feel like for me that I've definitely done this in the context of talking to my team about things that I want to share about, and I think generally, I think there is a call for us to be a bit braver, to be honest. And I, you know, people say you speak from your scars and not your wounds, which some people find helpful. Sometimes I find it hard to know what's a scar and what's a wound. So I'm like, to be honest with you, but like, I know people have said that's helpful, but for me, I know I've really prayed hard, and I've read the Psalms, and you can see the laments there. You can see the crying out there. I remember one, Tilly, I was the main speaker at Spring Harvest on the last night or something, and I was sitting on the front row, and I felt God say to me, "Tell him that you're really struggling with anxiety now." And I was like, "No, it's definitely a word from the devil," and because I've never heard anyone say that on the main stage. I've heard seminars and, you know, the little side talks and stuff, but I've never heard anyone say it in front of 3,000 or 4,000 people, or when they have said it, like 25 years ago when I suffered from depression. And I felt like, and then I looked at my notes. I was meant to be preaching on humility, so I thought, oh no. And so halfway during the talk, I just went for it. I went, you know, so often we talk about these things in the past, but this is something I'm really struggling with today. I'm learning to manage it, I think, but I really, really struggle with anxiety. I do. Yeah. And I have never received so many emails in all my life. I had emails from the Butland staff. You know, it was like emails from people just saying, wow, absolute game changer for me. The interesting thing is, you know, things like, we've got to remember that suicide is one of the youngest, is the killer of young men more than anything else. And I think it's something like staggering, like 40% of people who complete suicides don't tell anyone they're feeling depressed or low. Yeah. So somehow we have to hold the tension. We have to work it out. And I think doing that in the context of relationship and accountability. But going forward with COVID, everyone struggled with their mental health. And as we've all struggled with our physical health and stuff. So I do think a much more honest conversation needs to happen.
Yeah. And perhaps as we start being more honest about this stuff, like you said, everyone's going through it now. Yeah. Perhaps that means it stops becoming such a taboo and stops becoming such a big thing that we can just naturally talk about it. And then that's when it gets into discipleship and all of that stuff.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So on that, do you have any suggestions as to some safe spaces or organizations for leaders to access to work through any of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so what happened with us is 3 years ago now, I was leading quite a successful youth charity, and I felt God say it's time to let it go. And I'm like, I'm a founder. We don't let go. And he was like, no, you really do need to let it go. And I was like, this is mad. But God really broke our heart for people that are struggling with emotional mental health and isolation. So we set up a charity called Kimsugi Hope, which was going to tackle mental health and social isolation. And to cut a really long story short, what we did after a year of planning and piloting, we created a 12-week program based on Alcoholics Anonymous, but for well-being, for emotional and mental health. And we just encouraged churches to run this within their life groups. We train them online. We check the safeguarding because obviously there's vulnerable adults there. We do all that sort of stuff. But then we say, invite all your neighbours. And what happened was just incredible. So before lockdown, we had 40 partner churches. At the end of the year, we had over 200 with about 750 leaders. And the whole concept was create a safe and supportive space within your community. And I think what I used to say in the training to the Christians is, this isn't about them and us. It's just about us. And we all talk about faith, you know, so in our group, so when you get anxious, you pray. How does that work? You know, you Christians, do you have to forgive everyone? I thought that was a good question. I asked my wife to answer that one. you know, it was like we went through the 12 weeks, and at the end of the 12 weeks, a lot of the people just wanted to stay part of the life group. And since then,
Yeah.
we've seen these safe and supportive spaces start in homeless shelters, schools, for mums who've lost their kids to foster care, in youth groups. And it's almost like a movement has happened, I think. And to be honest, it's just come through frailty and brokenness rather than, da-da, here we are to save you, as
Yeah.
sometimes we've done in the church.
Yeah.
We're here to listen. We're here to create a safe place. And so I'd really encourage people, if if your church isn't running a well-being group, maybe really think about it, because it's really special, actually, really special.
Yeah. So if people on this seminar want to start those groups, so they just go to the website and
Yeah. There's a groups page there, and it's got all the info. And actually, it's as easy as ever now. We've just managed to get all the application stuff online, so hopefully it'll be more straightforward after years, a year of paper.
It's amazing how COVID's made everything streamlined. No, it's okay. I mean, it's probably related, but someone's asked, how do we go about changing a culture that views weakness, illness, and suffering as a problem to be fixed, especially in our faith-filled, charismatic churches? So how do we change that culture?
Yeah, that is a big one, isn't it? So I always define culture as the way we do things around here. And so actually I think now, and that's why like the whole bouncing forwards thing is so important, is like, let's not bounce back, let's bounce forward. What do we need to change in terms of our preaching, in terms of some of our worship songs as well? And and so we're working on this project called Mentally Healthy Friendly Church, and so I'm doing some research at the moment around what would that look like? What are people's experience of mental health in church? How often do we preach around issues around depression and anxiety and eating disorders and self-harm, and how do we grapple with this stuff that's going to be so real in people's lives? And I actually feel like after COVID, the mental health challenges may be even tougher for people, because I feel like sometimes when you're going through a really tough time, it's a bit like when you go on war, they go to war. The adrenaline's running high, and then they come back, and then that's when it happens. It is staggering to me that more soldiers in America completed suicides than died in the Iraqi war when they returned. And so I do think we've got to start changing culture, and one of the ways we start changing culture is we start having these honest conversations, and we have to model it as leaders, I think. Honesty always breeds more honesty, and so go gently, but I think we need to start.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So in terms of that honesty, someone's asked, how do we create honest space in leadership to lament when the demands of the people we're leading are so high? So how do we balance that?
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about lament is always done in the context of worship, which is really interesting. And so one of the things that we've been doing is really talking about lament, because I think lament is like turning towards God and grappling, asking questions. I remember at one event that we did is we just got this big cross at the front, and we got everyone to write something down that they've been carrying for too long. And in the context of worship, everyone came and they put it on the cross, and it wasn't like, it's all sorted now. But there was a sense of like, oh my goodness, God, even though life is really tough, I'm going to worship you. And I think that's like spiritual maturity, right?
Yeah.
That's almost like a miracle, because we often talk about physical miracles and the show reel and one spectacular story after spectacular story. When someone's got cancer and they've got like a few months to live, and they go, God, I don't get it, but I'm going to trust you anyway. That speaks volumes to non-Christians, actually.
Yes.
And so I think like in our worship is the place to lament and teach lament and to model lament. And I wrote in the book, which I found really challenging, was when I looked at the issues around grief and bringing our grief to God. Tanya Marlowe, who some of you may have heard of, she's amazing. She has ME, so she gets out of bed like an hour a day. And she said to me, we've really got to start seeing grief as a capital G and a lowercase g. A capital G is like major bereavement. We've lost someone we really love. It affects everything, and it is major. But a lowercase g is in this time we've all lost something. It was my daughter's 18th. She had all these ideas of what was going to happen. gone. Me and my wife's wedding anniversary, 25 years gone. Our holiday we had to cancel. Kids have lost friendships. We've all lost something, and the key is this: is whether it's a big G or lowercase g, it needs to be grieved. Those emotions need to be labeled, and we need to allow people to grieve in this next season. And I think it's so important. And I think the problem is what we do is us who've got the lowercase g, we don't grieve well because we go, my pain's nothing like your pain. So my sister's like an ITU nurse, and she's been on the front line. So I feel like I have no right to complain about anything, given what she's been. But actually, that doesn't help her. It doesn't help me. And I think these conversations are really, really important. So how do we grieve well in this period?
That's so good. That's so good. And I was actually just doing a training course on self-harm during COVID, and actually saying the exact same thing of people are so aware that there are greater problems, they don't want to get involved. So there's people who are self-harming and should be seeing medical care that aren't, because they don't want to overwhelm the nurses who have bigger problems. But actually, when we can create that culture where capital G, little g, both are problems, we talk about that, it's going to be more beneficial for society.
Absolutely.
Love that. So someone asked if you could just re-explain the difference between acceptance and resignation, and they're a bit foggy on that.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the first place to healing is to accept the situation that you're in. I met a lot of Christians who are into this whole denial thing, like I'm not sick, you are sick. But I don't think it's a life sentence. So for me, particularly with my journey around mental health, was that I had to accept that anxiety was something I really struggle with. And to be honest, it was really painful as a leader because I had so many platitudes given to me. One was like, you've given the devil a foothold in your life, or you need to have more faith, or you need to trust God more, as if I wasn't trying those things. And I realized I had to accept this is where I was at and I needed to get help. But in that resignation is like, I quit. This is what I'm going to be like forever. There's no freedom here. And I think that's almost what happened for the people that survived in the concentration camps. They didn't lose hope, because hope and optimism are two different things, right? We can be optimistic about the weather being nice tomorrow, but hope is something bigger and deeper. And so I think that those two distinctives are really important. And I guess just very quickly, another analogy I use in bouncing forwards is Jeremiah 29 verse 11, which was actually written to people in exile. And it was written as a response to Hananiah, who'd actually prophesied that exile would be over in 2 years. And it was almost like God said through the prophet Jeremiah, guys, it's not going to be 2 years. It's going to be 70 years. That's what it says. That's the context of that verse. That's a great fridge magnet, but always taken out of context. And like, you're going to be here for 70 years. In other words, accept the situation you're in. But you know what? This isn't to be wasted. You can plant gardens, settle down. You can pray for the peace and prosperity of the city. And in that context, I've still got plans to prosper you and to give you hope. And I think that's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, absolutely. So good. So good. So you talked a bit about the rescuer mindset in that talk. How, if we've got anyone watching that are stuck in that rescuer mindset in terms of their leadership, how would you suggest they go about trying to give that over to God and get out of that mindset?
I think it takes a lot of humility, and I think it's that he's God and we're not. And I think that when we try and rescue people, I know for me, it came out of a really good heart, in the sense. And I had to learn that, it's classic in the counselling, you're not the rescuer, only Jesus can rescue. And you can't be the sponge as well. You can't absorb everything. You can't function that way. So the way I look at it is Jesus on the road to Emmaus. I love the fact that the day after Jesus' resurrection, he decided to walk with two heartbroken people. He didn't decide to do a feeding of the 5,000 gig. He didn't decide to do another Sermon on the Mount. And these were two uninfluential people. They didn't matter. you know, in the eyes of society, and the listening, you know, and again, I think we need to listen in this stage, in this season, because at any one point, if you think about it, he could have jumped in and gone, guys, all this pain, all this stuff you're talking about, Jesus who got killed, I'm Jesus, we don't need to have this conversation anymore. But actually part of the healing process was allowing them to speak. And then I just love the fact that over a meal, over brokenness, when he broke the bread, that's revealed who Jesus was. And so the temptation is to rescue, but I think we have to start creating better habits. And I think the other thing I'd say, which is a big topic, but I feel like how we measure success in the church is a really interesting question, particularly in leadership. I think the matrix of measuring success is often on what you call outputs, which is numbers.
Yeah.
We need to be outcome based, the tangible difference that people get transformed by God. And I was saying to my team, you know, success for us really is that we all disappear in 10 years, because there are so many safe and supportive spaces in the church around this country. We're not near, you know. So let's reduce the staff team in 10 years rather than build it up, because God is doing something in the church. So I think if we can reframe success in kingdom terms, that would be really good for us at this season.
Yeah, that's a big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we've got that time though, we can be doing that. Lovely. Okay, so in terms of leading when you're not okay, do you think there ever comes a time where we need to step back for a bit? And if so, when do you think that time comes? And yeah,
I think there is a time. Yeah, definitely. I think that sometimes you can be in a place where you're going to crash, and that's why I talked about that resilience river. I find that incredibly helpful of trying to work out, is my resilience at a level which actually is unhealthy? I'm crashing all the time, and actually when I was doing that, my inner critic was going mad, because I was meant to put up this diagram here, which that's my resilience river. So
okay.
that's the things that draw me down and the things that lift me up. And what I found in doing this is actually really helpful, really, really helpful to have a healthy self-awareness, not selfish, but it's healthy to go, what are the things that push me up? What are the things? And you can get this off the website, you can print it off as a freebie, but like, I feel that that's really important. And I think what you tend to find is the people around you will tell you as well. My wife definitely told me, and we need to do that. Yeah, definitely need to do that and process stuff. The other thing I found really interesting in the recent research I've done is I think a lot of us as leaders, we go through quite traumatic experiences. And I know my wife wrote a chapter called Secondhand Smoke, and the whole idea of secondhand smoke is secondhand smoke can still kill you. So you might not be the one going through a cancer journey. You might not be the one who's, you know, kids being stabbed. You might not be the one. But actually, when you get so close, it does affect you, because we're human beings, right? And it's how we process that trauma, how we process that stuff's really important. And one of the things I found staggering in the research, it was saying that trauma is always stored in your body. So, for instance, if I went to hospital now, just to go and see someone, my heart would start racing, because I've been in hospitals so many times. In my head, logically, I can work it out. You need to go there, visit someone, you need to do that. But trauma's stored in your body. And so I think how we process trauma, and, you know, there's a lot around being trauma informed and understanding that, it, again, in this season, could be really helpful for many people in church leadership to understand those things.
Yeah, so good. Lovely. Okay, well, we're nearing the end, so if anyone's got any burning questions, do stick them on the chat. I've got one last one. So you talked about self-compassion, and obviously your first thoughts when you were told about that, and stereotypes maybe of what that is. For us today, what would you say are the first steps to getting that self-compassion in place?
Well, I think self-compassion it is linked to self-kindness, but I think self-compassion for me was dealing with my inner critic, because I could do some of those self-compassionate things, but if I'm still thinking in a really critical, self-critical way, and I started to realize to me, like, what was driving that inner critic, you know. And so the interesting thing on my river, I put shame that leads to perfectionism And I think perfectionism is like that unrelenting standard thing, you know, is like, it's got to be perfect. I'm sure every Christian leader can relate to this. So often at the end of a service, you will get the Christian who wants to tell you something in love, you know, which is normally code for "I want to destroy you." And you can have 99 people. I could read all the comments and go, "Oh, that's really nice." Most people enjoyed that, and then they'll be like, "Well, I didn't, you know, a negative one." In bed at night, all I'm going to think about is the negative one, and it's like, perfect. And the thing is, you can't please everyone all the time. But often, if you allow perfectionism, and that's a tiny example, that produces anxiety, which then obviously can produce depression and stuff like that. So for me, it was really going, I've got to deal with that inner critic. Is that what God says about me? My friend Will Vanderhart is a really close friend of mine from Mind and Soul. He was like, if you can imagine your thoughts as trains going into a station, he said a lot of people think, you know, you must never allow a negative thought in your head. The fact is, we all know the more you try not to think about something, the more you think about it, right? It's like, you know, if I said chocolate now, everyone would be like, oh no, I don't want to think about chocolate. And everyone's going to want a chocolate bar after the session. But like, it's like the more you try, and then you get yourself really worked up. It's a bit like trying to sleep. You know, the worst thing is to try and sleep. Because then you can't sleep. And I think like it's a bit like that with negative thoughts. And I know for me, it's been a lot about, I allow the train to come into the station, but I've got a decision whether to get on the train and let it take me into the really dark place. And not getting on the train is going, God, what do you say over me? What do my best friends say over me? What do my people that really love me say over me? And it's normally the opposite to my inner critic. And I think that I'm on a process of shifting that. And so I live under what hopefully what God says over me, and not just what my inner critic has a good go at me about. It's not easy though, is it? It's all a process.
No, and the inner critic knows, doesn't it? Knows your weakness. It knows what triggers you. But yeah, you're right. Be thinking of what God says. Lovely. Well, thank you so much. We've got so much thanks in the chat as well for how vulnerable, honest, and helpful this has been. Before we go, that book that you've been talking about, The Bouncing Forwards, you've got your book launch coming up, haven't you? 28th of March, 8 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. online. Tickets can be found on Eventbrite. I'll stick a link in the chat for that. You've got lots of input from very interesting people, it looks like. So we've got Eva Schloss, who's in the video I saw. So that was Anne Frank, stepsister and Holocaust survivor, John Sutherland, ex-Met Police commander and author, and loads more. So yeah, Jess has stuck that link in the chat. I would really encourage anyone to go along to that, because it sounds like that book is going to be very helpful, especially coming out of the COVID times. Lovely. Well, a big thank you, Patrick. Can't thank you enough for that. Yes, and hope you have a good rest of your day, everybody. And just to say, actually, from Joe's talk, and Joe and Lakunde were talking about the future is local and we need to be going into our communities. I think the Kimsugi Hope groups is going to be so good for that. So I would just encourage everyone, get your churches on that, get the community involved, and let's start changing the culture around us and be more honest with them. Lovely. Oh, so much thanks for you, Patrick. Yes, lovely to have you with us.
Thanks so much. Thank you for inviting me.
See you later. Oh, you're welcome. See you later.